Devil All the Time is a new film on Netflix. It is a crime/psychological thriller based on a novel of the same name by Donald Ray Pollock, who also narrates this film. Now, our written review of The Devil All the Time is currently on Cinemaholics.com. Lizzie Combs reviewed the film, and she had some mixed things to say about it. She said a lot of the things that she liked. She pointed out some pretty glaring flaws, including a couple that I hadn't fully considered myself. Now, the film is directed and co-written by Antonio Campos, and this is kind of a family production. He co-wrote the film with his brother Paolo. His wife edited the film, Sophia Subrixo, I think that's how you say it. And their child is young infant Arvin in the film. So a lot of personal touches in this movie. The ensemble cast is pretty stacked. Of course, we have Tom Holland, also Bill Skarsgård, Riley Keough, Jason Clarke, Sebastian Stan, Haley Bennett, Eliza Scanlen, Mia Wasikowska, and Robert Pattinson. And one thing that I said in my own review of the film on the Spool is that I thought it was interesting how this film reminded me in a lot of ways of Lawless, which also has Jason Clarke and Mia Wasikowska. As far as the plot goes, this is kind of an interesting one, and I'm not entirely sure how to even cover it. So I'll turn it over to you, Abby. How would you describe the plot of this one to somebody who is kind of going into this fresh? Maybe they see it on the Netflix landing screen. They see Tom Holland's face and they're like, I'm in.
Okay. Deep breath. It is kind of a hard one to explain concisely, but it is sort of a multi-generational, I guess, crime epic. It starts with Bill Skarsgård's character, who is a soldier in World War II in the Pacific, I think. And he comes back with a fair amount of undealt with PTSD and meets Haley Bennett, who's a waitress who he later marries. And shortly after they get married, she gets cancer. They have Arvin, their son, who grows up to be Tom Holland. So Bill Skarsgård's character, he develops a very particular and kind of frightening way of praying behind the house to try and heal his wife's cancer, which doesn't work. She dies. And their son, Arvin, ends up going to live with his grandmother and uncle in Ohio, I think. They go from West Virginia they go from Ohio to West Virginia. Yeah.
Yes, Coal Creek, West Virginia. We should say this is all very early in the film. Like, not getting a lot of
it happens. Yeah, it happens very quickly. Also, around the same time, Riley Keough's character, Sandy, she hooks up with Jason Clarke's character, Carl, who is a photographer and also a budding serial killer. And the two of them end up having kind of a serial killer Bonnie and Clyde type relationship that goes throughout the film.
Yeah, with like weird hints of necrophilia too. It's pretty nasty.
Very weird hints of necrophilia. And so Arvin grows up alongside Lenora, who's played by Eliza Scanlen, who is the ward of his grandmother and uncle. And you get a little bit more information on Lenora's backstory in the first half of the film as well. And their lives are okay, but disrupted by Robert Pattinson, who is a kind of itinerant preacher who has eyes for Lenora and kind of does wrong by their family. And Tom Holland takes it upon himself to try and enact revenge on Robert Pattinson. And that turn also eventually brings him into contact with Sandy and Carl. So that is kind of the best way that I can try and concisely describe the plot. It's very sprawling and it covers a lot of ground. I personally kind of like the way that it approaches the story in the way that it does, but we can get into that a little bit more later.
Yeah, that's one of the first things I do want to talk about, because even on top of that, we also have Sebastian Stan as a corrupt sheriff, and his story is kind of connected to one person, but it's also connected to Arvin. And yeah, in my review, I compared this to, like, if you took a Tarantino film, like as recent as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and you mashed it with Life Itself, the 2018 film, where it just seems it's almost a parody sometimes how these characters are connected. I think the general idea that Pollock was going for in his book, which is supposed to be a little bit more episodic, but even in this movie, which he clearly was happy with since he partook in it, is that everybody in this area just like knows each other. And it's kind of about that. It's about how connected all of these people are. This is a very troubling area of the United States. I've been to this area. I've never been to Knockemstiff, but I've been to this part of Ohio. I've been to West Virginia, obviously, grew up in Virginia. And what the period details are pretty impressive in that regard of like, you do understand that this story is very personal to the original author. So it is an interesting choice in Campos to come in here and turn it into a film along with cinematographer Lal Crowley into something just really epic and invigorating in a lot of ways. But okay, Will Ashton, I want to know what you generally think of this film, and if you can key in a bit on kind of the sprawling nature of it. Did it work for you? This is a long film, 138 minutes. I know if a film if you don't like a film and it's that long, we're looking at trouble.
Well, admittedly, I've been watching quite a few long films, so the length didn't bother me as much as maybe the tone did. But yeah, as far as the movie itself, I'm a big fan of Antonio Campos' style. And one reason why is I feel like I really enjoy his like very specific type of character focused filmmaking, where it's like the style is a little bit drawn back and we just kind of fall into lives of different assorted characters, but it's usually very centralized or singular, I guess, to one like specific person that he follows, like with Christine, or in After School with Ezra Miller. And so, yeah, with those films, like it does seem like he's a little bit more like keyed to one person, whereas this one is an intentional challenge. He is definitely doing it as like an ensemble piece, which I think is intriguing and inviting in a few curious ways. I definitely agree with the sense of place and the like mood and general kind of like vibe and eeriness of it. I really appreciate, and I really like the like sense of locale as far as like the time and place. But as far as the movie itself and the narrative itself, I did really feel that like the narrative, because it is based on what seems to be a fairly sprawling book. I haven't read it, but it feels like there's a long text here that is being condensed down to like a little over 2 hours. And I do feel like we get the like bare bones of the story, but I never fully connected to a lot of the characters in a way that felt super meaningful. And I think that's because the story itself is so focused on like the like grief and the like despair and all like these like terrible, horrific things, that it feels kind of more like they are those things, is to the point where it's like I don't really get the full extent of their humanity. It just kind of feels like they're at the service of all these terrible things that are going on, which, you know, I get that's for the purpose of the story as far as what it's saying, but it does prevent me from fully connecting with it, because it feels like at times like it's going for a bleakness for the sake of being bleak, which I mean, I guess that's where I kind of go back and forth as far as like what I appreciate about the film and what I find myself kind of pushed away by. But I don't dislike it per se. I guess I have similarly mixed feelings on it.
I've seen this notion kind of floated around in some other reviews for the film. Particularly, Charlie originally kind of felt that same sentiment of that it's bleak for the sake of being bleak. I highly disagree. I highly disagree with that. I think that it's valid if people come out of it that way.
I mean, it's not that I fully believe that, but yeah, I mean, at times that's what I feel, to clarify.
I do think Campos isn't trying to do that. And in my case, that's not how I came out of the film. I did not come out of it feeling like this was trying to oppress. I thought that it was trying to illustrate and then end on a very hopeful tune, which we can't get into without giving away certain things. But I do think that my most generous reading of the film is that it is sort of educating on how to break out of cycles of violence. You know, we should point out that this movie takes place, I think we mentioned before, but it's like in the middle of two wars, right? Like Abby mentioned, the Pacific theater of World War II is what Arvin's father goes through. And then the Vietnam War is kind of on the horizon, because the film covers mainly the 40s, 50s, and then the 1960s. I think what this film does really well, I think where it gets me kind of connecting to it, is that I don't want to connect to any of the characters except for Arvin and Lenora. And I think the film does succeed in getting me connected to them, especially Arvin. I am a little bothered by how the film treats its female characters. And I think that that's a big limitation, because that is something that does feel grim, and it does feel over the top in a way that I don't think is as effective. And it falls into some tropes in that way, like the fridging trope and all kinds of things we can get into. But I gotta say, this film really worked for me. But what do you think, Abby, of some of the criticisms and praisings flying around so far?
Yeah, I understand, I think, where people are coming from when they say that the amount of content in this story is it kind of takes away from the character development in some places. I personally think that this would have worked really well as a miniseries, and given Antonio Campos's style of filmmaking, I think probably would have allowed him to focus and like kind of drill down more on one character at a time. Because the characters that are in this there's so much going on, and I would love to spend all kinds of time finding out like what makes each of them tick, because really what we get is a sketch, but it's a fascinating sketch, and you know that there's more going on. I also appreciated the film for kind of its approach to storytelling patterns and kind of patterns within the cycles of the lives of the characters, which is a thing that I really appreciate. Especially when I critique movies from a faith-based angle, because that's often how I look at spirituality too. So I thought it was super interesting to see all the patterns and the ways that the characters' lives connected, and how they related to each other, even in kind of tangential ways, and how we can be influenced by the stories of people that we're directly related to, people who we encounter, and also experiences that we don't even encounter firsthand, and how that can kind of influence us long term. So that was another thing that I really appreciated about the film. And aesthetically, I'm a huge fan of kind of Appalachian, Ozarkian, Southern Gothic kinds of things. Rural Gothic,
Yeah,
I guess,
same.
is the
Yeah.
better description of that. Because I've heard the film described as Southern Gothic by some folks, and it's really not. It's set in Appalachia, which is a different culture. So I'd say rural Gothic is probably a better description of that.
I've said Southern Gothic. I guess I'm a little bit more flexible with the term, but I see your point.
Yeah, I think it's probably due more to kind of literary conventions, which I totally get. But the regionalist in me is like, no, this is not the South. This is Appalachia. This is the Rust Belt.
I was gonna say, I feel like everyone is in a rural Gothic movie except for Robert Pattinson, who's in a Southern Gothic movie. And I mean that.
Oh, sure, yeah, he's in a Southern Gothic movie. Although around the time when the guy who runs the church is like, my nephew who went to Bible college is coming, I was like, never trust a Bible college boy. But
yeah, I will say, as someone who grew up in Virginia, we consider West Virginia more South than Virginia, and we were on like the southwestern border. So even though it's literally not the case, it is sort of a perception of the region. So I could see why Pollock, and then by extension Campos, felt like that's the aesthetic to go for. So even if it is a little inaccurate.
Yeah, and I think it totally works too. Like that's an aesthetic that I really enjoy. I get kind of a murder ballad vibe throughout the entire thing, which is also kind of a fascinating area. Also traditionally not super kind to women, so I kind of understand where that's coming from too. But I liked the style of it a lot. I liked Donald Ray Pollock's narration an awful lot, to the point where I actually just recently checked out another book of his from my local library because I want to read more of his things.
Absolutely. I really want to focus in, because I agree with you totally on the aesthetic of the film. I think Crawley is just a fantastic cinematographer and doesn't get enough credit. I have to say, when it comes to the religious stuff in this, I was concerned as the film started, and I was like, okay, here we go. Like, I don't like it when films use religious imagery to sort of make the world feel black and white in terms of like good and evil, and not understand that, like, sometimes I just feel like filmmakers want religion to be something that's not nuanced because maybe of like pent up anger or resentment toward organized religion, and using it as a cudgel to sort of say something just blanket and mean spirited about a lot of people who do have faith. So I was concerned about that as the film progressed, and I was pleased by the way that I definitely didn't get the impression that the film is trying to say anything about like negative about faith. It's clearly showing the horrors and the abuses of like biblical literalism, which plainly means like cherry picking things out of the Bible or out of a sermon or what have you, and using it to justify atrocity. That's a very simple concept, and I think it's really hard for a lot of movies to balance it very well. And the ones that do it pretty well, films like The Neon Bible, for instance, I really appreciate, because it helps you distinguish between moments when somebody, like, for example, every preacher in this movie is pretty despicable. Even one that you don't think is very despicable on the surface, the film finds a way to be like, no, he was terrible too. Or not terrible, but clearly he had his own demons, right? And from that angle, I thought the takeaway was very, very impressive in how it wraps up Arvin's story, for example, and where he sort of has to go in order to make peace with his own hangups. Because I can't imagine growing up like he does, with a father who takes these biblical lessons to their extreme. And the last thing I'll say too is I think the only like good Christians, quote unquote, are his like his aunt. I was gonna say aunt and uncle, but his grandmother, I should say. She was the grandmother, I believe.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump in on that because you mentioned that your Extra Milestone podcast, they're talking about The Night of the Hunter in their new episode, which happens to be one of my favorite movies for very similar reasons to the reasons that I was interested in the portrayal of religion in this film too. That it's both are kind of depicting a very specific kind of religion that feels specific to kind of rural regions, and I think also portraying the kind of trauma that it can inflict on certain people, particularly young people, and the way that they have to kind of reckon with kind of the faith of their culture, of their families, and how that has changed. And I think you're right, John, that I think it wraps up very, very nicely in Arvin's story, where by the end of the film, we're kind of seeing him at a crossroads, and you're not really sure where his story is going to go. But given the experience that he just had, where he kind of reconciles his father's actions, I think kind of puts him in an interesting place moving forward, to the point where you think he might just be slightly more well balanced because of what he's gone through.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm still processing this movie. I have not figured it out. Like, I'm still processing what it says about suicide as well. But that plays into, as we can get into our final thoughts. Just, I think the film's dense thematic energy is so fascinating to me. But let's get into our final thoughts and grades. We can start with you, Will Ashton. It seems like you're not as positive on the film, but it sounds like, there were things you liked, some things though that you want to bring up that kind of brought the film down a little bit for you.
I mean, well, to go off your conversation about religion, I do want to add one thing, which is that I did notice that, I have haven't read a ton of reviews, but I have read some where they were talking about like, oh, like this movie is all about like God is dead and the devil is around, because I guess maybe they take the title very literally. Yeah. And I was like, I never really got that vibe, because there is like some sense of morality to the film, like as far as like the characters, like there is like a sense of justice throughout for none of them, and there is like a theme of religion being used in the ways that you two mentioned. So I just wanted to add that as well. But in any case, as far as the movie itself, yeah, I mean, it's not that I think Antonio's intent is ever to be like, let's make a movie as like dark as possible or like anything like that. I just think that because the style gets so like kind of like jumbled with the multiple storylines, and that we don't really get to see the full nuance of some of the things that are explored here. And there are a lot of very heavy things, like you said, like suicide, and then like, murder and assault and all these things. And that when we don't really fully get the time to like really extend them, and only really kind of just like get the like hits of them as far as like just like back to back to back, I do kind of feel like that takes away like some of the more like thoughtfulness that I think was intended here as far as the approach. And I think that's where I was going with before, where it just feels like when we don't fully get the breadth of that, and we don't really get to like see a lot of the grieving beyond like just like kind of snippets, I feel like that makes it a little bit hard to connect beyond the bleakness as far as the story itself. But I do appreciate, to the extent that I do think, as an adaptation, as far as like getting the tone and the sense of place and the mood of it, and I do really appreciate the narration as well. And I am curious to check out the author's work, because I can see like as far as like the broad approach to the narrative, like I do appreciate what he's going for. And I think there is a lot of respect paid there as far as like, getting his words in and kind of like setting his style and his tone throughout. And I think it is respectful in that sense. But as far as the movie itself, like I think there's a lot to value here, and I similar to you two, I'm still thinking about it because I just finished it earlier today. So my thoughts are still fresh on it. I might go back and forth, either good or bad, but I think it is pretty good for what it is. Like I don't dislike the film per se. I just feel like there's a stronger film here that maybe just got a little bit too edited down, or like maybe in the like post-production process maybe got a little bit too jumbled to a point where we don't fully get the nuance of the characters and the full extent of their inner lives. But I mean, it is a solid film as far as all the technical stuff. And I do appreciate the performances, even though people are giving Pattinson a lot of slack. I thought he was a lot of fun in this, and
same.
I enjoyed his weird little Southern accent. I thought it fit the character well, as far as like this, faulty priest with a like radio background. I don't know. I thought the voice was fine. I don't really get all the beef with it, but Twitter is going to be Twitter, I guess. But in any case, I mean, I'd say maybe like a low B minus, just because like I do appreciate what he's going for here, and I don't think it's bad. I just think there's a better film here that doesn't fully come out.
All right. Low B minus from Will. All right, Abby, what about you? What's your final thought and your grade on this one?
Yeah, it's a little difficult for me to figure out like a solid. I wobble between B and B minus because I like the themes of the film a lot. I think the aesthetics are great. I think the soundtrack is great. There's a lot that it does very well. But I think formally there's some bits that don't quite cohere. There are some characters that don't really get the attention that they need and end up feeling kind of ancillary to the plot and really kind of unnecessary in the film as a whole. I feel like it could do with a little a different organization style. I still think that it probably has enough content that it would have worked better as like a mini series instead of a 138-minute movie where nobody really gets quite the time they need to kind of breathe and fully develop. So I would say like a low B or a high B minus is kind of where I'm sitting.
All right. Yeah, we'll finish with me. I'm certainly the more positive on this one. And I'll say I like everybody in this. You know, Robert Pattinson and in particular, and Tom Holland for sure. I have to say, I think what really makes this film work for me is I found it to be very escapist in a very weird way. And I think the reason I didn't feel like oppressed by it, or I didn't feel like the bleakness was bringing me down, is because this film does what I think real life can't do, and that's provide an actual sense of justice to a disorganized world. Because in the way that a book can put you in the mind's eye of the author, or it can give you a bird's eye view of everything, the film is sort of about how, you know, everything as it is perceived in real life can be very nuanced. You know, if you looked at this series of events involving Arvin and his father and his family, a lot of the truth of what really happened would be hidden in real life because we can't rely on each other. We can't rely on oral history to really give us an honest account. But I think that's where the religious takeaway comes into it. And it says, if you believe in the tenets of religion, then you can believe in something as freeing as true justice without guilt or without blaming the people bringing on justice in their own way. And I think the film fully succeeds in my eye of bringing that out. And I guess like after watching the movie, I did feel in a weird way good. I don't know why, but I just felt like I had seen something take place that involved a kind of comeuppance for certain characters that I felt are in our real life. And it can be infuriating and frustrating sometimes when it feels like bad things just happen and nobody is there to correct the record. But I think the film and the book probably apparently by extension is able to get that across. So this is a film I've liked more and more of the last week since seeing it. Even after reading some negative reviews, I think I still really, really enjoy it. And I think if it weren't for like some of the incoherence and some of the ways that I think that the film sort of just really comes down on female characters in some jarring ways, and I think that can really bring the film down for a lot of viewers, then I would say this is a must watch. But as it is, I'm a pretty solid B+. I think that this is definitely worth recommending, even though I do understand it's pretty divisive. I think a lot of people will watch it and not like it as much as I do, but I think some people will probably like it even more than me.
Yeah, I'm glad that you were so positive on it. I came in thinking I was going to have to go to the mat for this between both of you. And I'm very glad that you liked it even more than I did. So great.
I love it when that happens. It's always fun.